Soul Circle conversation is around race. This past March, I celebrated 10 years of being an ordained pastor. And when you think about how the conversation around race has developed in our nation in the last 10 years, you can imagine that this hasn't been the easiest part of being a pastor for me. It hasn't been easy for any pastor I know. You're either talking about it too much or not enough. You're accused of being too political or not political enough. It's been a rough decade when it comes to conversations around race and church. This definitely came home to me in 2014. I was away for Thanksgiving with my family in Arizona, coming back for the first Sunday of Advent when I received the news that my colleague's mother had passed away, and I offered to preach for him that Sunday. So I was wrestling with the texts for that first Sunday in Advent, texts that are notoriously apocalyptic and prophetic. And at the same time, I was watching the news, and that was the week in which the grand jury decided not to move forward with the murder trial in the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And the streets of our nation's cities erupted. There were uprisings and protests and fires, and I'm watching all of this, and I'm looking at the text, and I knew I had to address it on Sunday. And yet at the same time, I didn't want to be divisive. I wanted to offer people a way forward, a way to engage with this based on the scripture. And so I preached a sermon about listening. I read a poem about listening. I cited the statistic that says that most Americans in this country do not have friends of color. And so we have to do extra work to learn to listen to those voices of color in our world, to understand the oppression and the anger and the frustration that was being vented. I thought I did a pretty good job on that sermon. I felt pretty good about it. And yet later that week, I had a gentleman in my office who was incredibly angry with me. It was one of the most difficult conversations I've had. He accused me of being naive and not understanding the issues. He threatened my job. It was pretty traumatic. But I learned something. I learned that even when we're trying to be invitational, even when we're trying to be gentle, even when we're not taking a side, just talking about this issue is like the third rail in our culture. And yet, I don't think that means that we should avoid it. I actually think that is just where the gospel needs to meet us, just where we're called to be as the Church of Jesus Christ, to enter into those conversations that are so deeply divisive and are yet about the valuing and the honoring of all people, about human dignity. And so I've continued to try to have these conversations, and it's been so fun in this last year to see how this church, Valley Presbyterian, has responded after the death of George Floyd. There have been small groups that have started. People have begun volunteering. People have been reading books. They've been looking at their own personal story. They've been having one-on-one conversations. And so when we were thinking about what we should talk about for these soul circles, race was an obvious choice because we were looking at those things that are present and top of mind for people in our congregation right now, and certainly in our nation. But still, the question is, why and how do we talk about this in church? Well, I think there's two reasons why, and that is because the conversation about race, definitely there's conversations to be had around legislation and around policy and training to be done and institutional changes that need to happen. But underneath all of that, there are two things that this conversation also includes. One is it's about our soul, and the second one is about our community. And when it comes to living out in the way of Jesus, soul and community are two very important things. The soul question is about who am I and where am I in this conversation? It's about locating where the story of race plays out for you. And it's a part of all of our lives. I know for me, I definitely was in that place early on in my life where I thought I didn't see color. It hadn't affected me. And yet as time has gone on, I've really seen that there are ways that I have an implicit bias. There are ways in which my soul has been damaged because I've been in primarily white spaces with white teachers, and I have not been able to benefit from that larger beloved community that Dr. King invited me to, invites all of us to. And so when we look at our soul, there's always work to do around this issue. Not in a way that is supposed to produce shame or guilt, but in a way that allows us to tenderly look at how our soul has been impacted by the dynamics of race in our world. I think church is a good place to do that. The second part is community, because once we have done our work, and even if we have our own ideas about how we've been affected, we're looking for others usually to work together with us, to engage with us in this work for reconciliation and healing. And so when we talk about race, we also want to talk about our community. Who are we going with on this journey for healing in our world? If you look around on a Sunday at Valley Presbyterian Church, you'll see a lot of people that are willing to go on that journey with you. And then if you look even a little broader, we are a part of a larger church, both Presbyterian and just generally Christian, a church that is as colorful and diverse as one could imagine. And so when we have this conversation as a church, we get to join a larger church that is also having this conversation. I love the fact that our local presbytery, our San Francisco presbytery, is engaging on this, because in our presbytery are Black churches, Brazilian churches, Latinx churches, Korean churches. And so when we talk about race as a church, we're talking all together, and we're able to learn from each other. We're able to begin to become that beloved community that Dr. King invited us to. So I invite you to do that work today. Think about your story, and where is your soul in this conversation? And think about together the ways we might work together to be a part of the healing of our nation and of our world. To move to a place where the table is a place where everyone belongs. And we realize the gospel of Jesus Christ. It says there should be no separation between us. That's what we're after. And that's why we have to talk about this as a church.